Hey guys, welcome back to GWiz Academy. In our last video, we saw numbers in Python. Numbers in the sense numeric data type category, right? We have understood inside that type of category, we have string, integer, float, and complex. Three data types inside numeric type category, right? Now, since we talked about numbers, since we talked about numeric type, there is an important concept here that we need to cover, and then we need to go further regarding other data types called as casting. So this is an important concept that we need to cover it before we enter into other data types. So what is this casting? Let's go back to our Visual Studio. Here, let's quickly create a new file as a presentation of new chapter, casting.py. Perfect. So now let's create three variables. X is equals to 1 as a string. Okay, this is a string. Why? I don't want this to be considered as a number. I want this to be considered as a string. So just in case, if I type x is equals to 1, it will be considered as a integer, but I don't want to consider it, make it an integer. So I have clearly made it string by adding this inverted commas, right? Okay, so first string variable has been created. Variable has been created x and the value is string, and next variable that I'll create here is y. That variable will have value, let's say integer. What is the integer that we can have inside it? 55, just a random number. And then let's name it as integer. Okay, and then third variable called z, and here let's add 27.01. this is a float. Okay, perfect. So this comment I have added so that it is easy for us to understand. First is string variable, second is integer variable, third is float variable, right? There are three variables right now in our file. Let's save it. Now you tell me what will happen if I use print function and check the type of, let's say, x variable. What should be the output? The output should be string. So is it so? Let's go ahead and see. Yes, the output is string. And what about if I print the type of, let's say, y variable? What should be the output? So the output should be integer, right? So let's scroll down. It is integer. And same way, if I print, let's say, the type of z variable, then obviously it should be a float. Data type is float. Perfect. So what is happening here is I am not telling Python that this is a string, this is a integer, this is a float, but Python is intelligent enough to understand whether this is an integer or either it is a string or it is a float based on the certain syntax. Here I have used double inverted commas, or even if I use single inverted commas, still the Python will understand it as a string, will consider it as a string. Here there is just pure numbers or whole numbers. That's the reason the Python understands it as an integer. And here, since we have decimal points, so Python understands this as a float, right? Perfect. So till now we understood that Python can self-understand, it is intelligent enough to understand what is the data type. But in certain situations, we need Python to consider a value in different data type. What does this mean? This means that there will be certain situations where I want Python to consider this 55 as a string, or let's say as a float. I don't want, see, I'll just type it once again. Y is equals to 55. This is what it is, right? So here y variable is nothing but 55, and Python now consider this as a integer by default. But in some situations, I want Python to consider this as a string, or I want Python to consider this as a float variable. How will Python understand this as a float variable? It is not possible, right? So it allows us to define as well. By default, Python can intelligently understand what is the exact data type. But in case if we want a custom data type, if we want Python to understand this as a custom data type, then we need to tell Python that render it as a float variable, render it as a string variable. See, this is integer, so I'll show you with an example. Integer to float or string. How define integer to float or string? By using construct function. So what is this construct function that we need to use so that the integer can be defined as float or string? This is a construct function that we use here. Is, don't worry about what is construct function, just ignore it, just think it as a function, just normal function. So y is equals to, let's say, float float parenthesis, and then inside parenthesis I'll write 55 instead of outside here. Now what am I doing here is I'm defining this 55 as a float, so that now Python will render this 55 as float itself. It will not consider this, it will not use its own brain and consider this as a integer. If we just simply write 55, then by default it will consider it as an integer. But right now I defined this particular value as a float. So now if you see, what will Python render it as? Print type y. So let me just simply comment it out, these other print outputs, so that it doesn't confuse you. All right, so right now we only have just one print type and one command print, and it will reflect whether if this particular value is a integer or float. We know that 55 is an integer, but now Python will understand this as a float value. So let's go ahead and see. Let's save this code and run it. See, Python now considers this as a float value. And same thing, let's say y is equals to string 55. We know 55 is a integer, but now since I defined this particular 55 as a string, now Python will consider this as a string itself, type y, right? So if you now go ahead and run the code, first here y is float, but then again I converted that y into string. So now it is called, the Python consider this as a string. So this is how you can change the data types. You can convert the data types. You can flip the data types. So right now what I did, I converted from integer to float or string. Same way, let's say define float to integer or string, right? So let's say I know that, let me just comment it off here. Okay, so now from float we will change it to integer and string. What is the float value? Z is a float value. So Z here is by default float value. So what I'll do, Z is equals to, what is the value? 27.01, right? 27.01. So this is the float value. So if this is a float value, and let's say if this is a float value, then if in case I want to convert it into integer or string, what I need to do, I need to define it as a string or integer. How to do that? I just need to define it as integer 27.01. That's it. Now if I see print type z and save it, you will see it as a integer. See, integer. And this is we use the type function to recognize what is the data type. But in case if I don't want to know the data type, I just want to print out the output. Let's say I'll comment it off. Let's say I simply print the output of what is z exactly. If I save it and now run it, so what is the output? 27. The decimal will go off, right? So from float we made that particular float value float into integer. How to do that? By defining what is the data type. We have successfully converted from float to integer. Similarly, let me quickly comment it off. Similarly, we can make z into, right now what we did, we converted float into integer. So what we will do now, float into string, we will convert it into a string. So str and then 24.01, right? Save it. Now if I click on, if I type print z, let's see what comes up. An integer value will show up, I'm sure. It's 27.01. Okay, so what is the data type? Let me, or let it be, or let me comment it off, these two things. Save, run the code. The type is string. The value is 27.01 itself, but as you can see, this 27.01 is being rendered as a string, not a float value. Okay, so this is how we can convert the data types as well. So you can simply comment, remove the comment. Yeah, so the thing is, this is how you can change values in the sense you can change the data types from integer to string, string to integer, integer to float, float to integer. But the thing is, you cannot convert, you can also convert, sorry, we have forgotten one more concept here, that is, let's just assume it as a variable c, which represents for complex number 27, 23, 26j. Okay, so this is a complex number. Okay, so here we can convert integer into complex as well. See, I'll show you. Y is a 55, right? So I'll put it inside parenthesis and I'll tell to make it complex. Save it. Okay, so complex numbers cannot be changed, but let's see, let's try. But before that, let's remove all these prints. Okay, so let me quickly print y, and also let me print type y as well. Okay, so let me go ahead and run this code. 55.0j. So we have successfully converted this particular integer into a complex data type, and as you can see, this function is printing out the value complex number, and print this type, we are this particular argument is printing out the output of what is the data type. Data type is nothing but complex. We have successfully changed the data type into complex from integer. Similarly, you can go ahead and do the same for float value as well. You can convert this float value into, let's say, z equals to complex 27.01. so now if I print it z, then let me comment off this earlier prints, save it. Okay, so now if I print z, so what happens, in z is nothing but a string. Okay, right now the z is string, and if I want to change it to complex number, then I'll define it as a complex and then I add the string. Now if I run the code, this is successfully created into complex number. And now if I want to test whether if it is a complex number or not, then I need to use a type function to check which type it is. And then if you see, if I run now, class complex, in the sense this z is a complex data type. So this is how you can change the data from one data type to another data type by defining it, defining what exactly you want to convert it to. But please note that you cannot change, not change from complex to other data type. And also you cannot change from text or text type data types, alphabetic data types, to string, integer or float, etc. Right? So the thing is, you cannot change the name Rakesh into a number. Let's go ahead and try that as well and see what happens. Let's create a variable called as name, and the data that it has is my name Rakesh. And if in case I want to change this particular name into something else, name has a string, it is right now it is a string, right? If I save it and see the check, it is a string. So now if I address it, if I define it as a integer and then I pass the value Rakesh, save it, I'll get an error. I'll remove this print as well or comment it off. Now let's go ahead and see what is the value error. Invalid literal for int, in the sense you cannot change the text or alphabetic data type to integer or float, right? So this is the example for this. Okay, so I hope you have clearly understood. So finally, this conversion from one data types to another data type is what is we call as type conversion or type casting. I hope you understood this whole concept now. Please watch this video again and again if you did not understand it. I'm sure if you're watching this for the first time, it might be daunting, or like say it, you might feel very overwhelmed. You will understand everything well while I'll be explaining, but when you try to implement it or execute it, you might get stuck somewhere. So I recommend you to type these things again and again, watch the video again and again, and practice it again and again. 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, again and again. Just, you don't have to memorize anything over here. You just simply need to understand the concept that is running behind these things, right? What exactly we are doing here? We are converting from string to float, float to string. What is integer? What is float? What is complex? These are the data types, right? So we are changing from one data type to another data type. So this is called as typecasting or type conversion, right? So I hope you have understood what exactly is this casting, and we will see further implementation process or logic behind these things, how to while we start working on exercises and stuff like that. But right now your foundation, your concept should be very clear, right? And in case if you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section. I'll be more than happy to answer your queries, right? Thank you very much for watching. Have a great day. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you.